Hello, everyone. Welcome to Planet Word's program. My name is Ashley Meadows. I'm the lead programmer for Planet Word, which is a museum in downtown Washington, D.C., dedicated to inspiring and renewing a love of words and language. We are so pleased to welcome Mia Cinelli here tonight to share her work, Speculative Characters, in this program series, Language Scene, which explores the intersection of language and its visual representations. We would love to connect with you and welcome you to future Planet Word programs. So in a moment, I'll drop our website in the chat so that you can connect with our future programs and maybe sign up for a newsletter or become a member. If you are a member, thank you very much for your support. We really welcome you here tonight. So tonight's program will explore typography, visual language, and how new punctuation might expand our tools for written communication. So it is my pleasure to introduce multidisciplinary artist, designer, and educator, Mia Cinelli. Thanks, Mia.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Thank you, Ashley, and thank you so much to Planet Word for having me this evening. I am so excited to share Speculative Characters for Visual Inflection. This is a project that's very near and dear to my heart, and I thank everyone for their enthusiasm and support. So, hi, I'd love to introduce myself. My name is Mia Cinelli. I'm an associate professor of art studio and digital design at the University of Kentucky in the School of Art and Visual Studies, where I teach. And as mentioned, I am a multidisciplinary artist, designer, and educator. So before I launch into Speculative Characters for Visual Inflection, I want to give just a little bit of context about my practice and how I arrived at this particular project. So I was trained as a graphic designer, worked as a graphic designer, I teach, but my projects tend to be maybe a little bit strange. I tend to work in what I like to call the expanded field of art and design. And what that means is I like to make projects that follow my own curiosity, right? Thinking about what feels really interesting in order to design meaningful experiences and interactions. So sometimes I'm working on graphic identities, sometimes I'm working on conceptual sculpture, sometimes I'm working on hand lettering. It really just depends. I like to ask questions and try and answer them in creative, interesting ways, and that takes on a lot of different media and a lot of different projects. But most often, my work tends to come back to typography and visual language. This is something I'm extremely interested in, and it shows up a lot in my work. It's something I really love. And for those of you who might not know, typography, I would define as simply being the visual arrangement of letter forms in space. How do we think about letters as they live near each other, and how do we make sense of them? So a lot of my works have engaged with typography and things like typeface design. So a few of these projects ended up being what I've been calling place-based typefaces, which are typefaces that are specifically designed around a particular time or location. The first of these is a typeface called Fayette that I designed in 2012. I was visiting a historic ghost town called the Fayette Historic Town Site in Fayette, Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where I'm from. And had found a really lovely handwritten kind of notes from an anonymous kind of bookkeeper of the 1880s, I think, roughly, and thought it was such a beautiful set of handwriting that I decided to make it into my very first digital typeface, which happens to be a record of this particular place and time. My next typeface was also a Michigan-based script called Mackinac 1895, which is based off of historic handwriting found on Mackinac Island, which is a really lovely island between the upper and lower peninsulas of Michigan. And so this was also a way of talking about a specific moment. Someone had hand inked all of these letter forms and went back over them, which I thought was such a wonderful way to take time to create beauty. And most recently, in 2021, I designed a very strange and lovely typeface called E for Elsewhere for the Elsewhere Living Museum and Artist Residency in Greensboro, North Carolina, which had a collection of very strange, fantastic artifacts like a tray to hold refrigerator letter magnets, and also had a really great collection of historic textiles, and thought, what if these went together in a typeface? So there is a fill and a pattern version of this, but this is a typeface specific to a place. And I love how this communicates. I find this really intriguing to think about how language might be indicative of a particular location or a particular feeling. And I find that shows up a lot in my work, because type in everyone's life is really important, whether we think about it often or not, because the way in which letters look influences how we perceive them. Type has meaning. So whether a typeface is bold or heavy or semi-bold or thin or regular weight or italic, this might tell us what we should read first. This creates hierarchy. This impacts legibility. This impacts emphasis. And so we encounter this every single day, so that the weight of a typeface, the placement of a typeface, and the actual text influence how we read things, how we perceive things, how we think about things. And so these are all things that I'm constantly thinking about and were kind of in my brain when this project began. So that's just a little bit of context. Because essentially, a few years ago, after a long day of teaching typography and thinking about typography and designing a typeface, I sat down next to my husband after a long day of work and went, oh. And he said, well, that's a heavy sigh. And normally that wouldn't have been like the most salient observation, except in that moment, I had a realization that the word used to describe the weight of the sigh is the same word we would use to describe the weight of a typeface. And that got me thinking, what would a heavy sigh look like typographically, or even like a semi-bold sigh for that matter? And I started thinking, why don't we have this as a character? Why doesn't this exist already? Because in reality, so much of our communication is nonverbal, right? We can communicate with each other quite effectively through things like facial expressions and sound and gestures. And when we don't have access to this, when we can't like see each other, like making these faces or doing these expressions, we find workarounds for this, such as emoticons. Of course, emoticons first generally appeared in the 1980s, and these are just recontextualized punctuation and letter forms in the shape of recognizable actions and expressions, right? So when we don't have the real thing, we find a way to work around it. And of course, even more recently, we have emojis. Now, I have to be really honest. I love emojis. I use them all the time. I think that they're fantastic. I think they are a wonderful addition to visual language. Now, my only problem, my only hesitation with emojis is that they're not super formal. I can't exactly put this in a formal email. I can't put this in a formal letter. And sometimes emojis can be a little bit too literal, albeit not always. But emojis help us create tone. They help us add into our language things that we otherwise might not be able to communicate. And I think tone is really important typographically. Typefaces have what I've been calling visual inflection. In the same way that we have vocal inflection, which helps set the idea and mood of whatever it is we're trying to communicate, typefaces do the same thing. So when we read this same word in many different ways, in many different typefaces, we can look at this and we can understand that each one of these things says something a little bit different and very specific. So typefaces carry visual inflection, but so does punctuation. When we look at these same words all in the same typeface with different punctuation, we read these in really different ways. Thanks with an exclamation point, of course, is really enthusiastic. Thanks with a period is kind of curt, right? Like if you get a text and it just says thanks with a period, you might be asking, did I do something wrong? Right? So we carry these connotations from punctuation alone, which implies inflection. So this then leads to the question, if this is how we're making sense of written language and how we're communicating with each other, what if we had more options, right? Like why are we limited to the punctuation that we currently have? What if we could have an expanded character set for gesture and expression, something that could formalize what we're doing with emojis or with emoticons in a more formal way, in something that makes sense in multiple typefaces, for instance. And so that's how these questions began. But the reality is that I'm not the first person to have this question. This lives in a history of what we might call speculative design. Now, the field of speculative design is a field of design which asks, what if? It asks, what could we imagine in the future? What could be that hasn't been? How could we get there? What are some new and cool solutions? So speculative design sometimes nestles against design fiction, which is creating almost like science fiction of going, well, this is a new idea, or this is something that's kind of out there. How do we get to it? But I really love the definition that Matt Malpass has for this, which is using design as a medium for inquiry. So the question itself is really important to the process. And of course, even though the term speculative design might be fairly new, people have been imagining designed futures for a really, really long time. So these questions follow a long line of other ideas and inquiries about what type could be if it incorporated more gesture and facial expression in its use. Case in point, pun not intended, is the manicule, which is one of my favorite characters. So the manicule is literally a pointing finger, and this was drawn originally in manuscripts, limited manuscripts in roughly the 12th century. And this works in a really literal way of saying, hey, you should look at this. This creates hierarchy and emphasis. And this evolved over time into its own character. So the manicule, sometimes called an index, sometimes called a printer's fist, is this character, is notably seen on the wanted poster for John Wilkes Booth after the assassination of President Lincoln, pointing to the reward as a way to say, hey, check this out. And on some typefaces today, you can still find the manicule. It has its own Unicode, so you can find it. There's a spot for it. And I think that this is a really lovely way of incorporating a literal gesture into typography and into characters that we use. We can think about even examples. This is from the 1880s, and this is an article from Puck magazine featuring typographical art by which its author has recontextualized parentheses, periods, and dashes to create faces of joy, melancholy, indifference, and astonishment a whole 100 years before we really see the emoticon come into use. And so these are things that people were thinking about as a way to expand our typographic communication. Around the same time, we have Ambrose Bierce, who wrote For Brevity and Clarity, by which he thought through a way of emphasizing humor in written language. And so what he did is he took a parentheses and simply turned it on its side in the form of a smile. And he said that this should be appended with the full stop to every jocular or ironical sentence, again, as a way to talk about smiling or humor within written communication. 1887. If we move a little bit further in history into the 20th century, we have what is another of my favorite examples, the interrobang. So in the 1960s, Martin K. Spector was working in advertising and realized that people were putting an exclamation point and a question mark next to one another as an incredulous sentence, right? We do this all the time. You go, what? And you put those two characters next to one another as a way to emphasize the question. And he said, you know, I think that there's a better and more elegant solution to this. So he proposed the interrobang, which combines these two characters into one as a way to mark these incredulous kind of inquiries. And I think this was a really brave idea because it's seeing a better way of doing things. And he proposed this. And while it never really took off, right, it's not something that we see every single day, it did make its way onto some typewriters in the 1960s, which I think is incredibly cool. And you can still find it in digital typefaces today, like the one shown here. Furthermore, moving into the 21st century, we have such examples as Arial sarcastic, courtesy of the sarcastic font movement, roughly in 2004. We all know and have all been advised we should not use sarcasm in email. That's because sarcasm relies entirely on tone of voice in order to be understood, right? And so when we write out great, does someone know if we mean great or great? So in order to solve this, the sarcastic font movement proposed Arial sarcastic, which takes the regular italics of Arial and slants it in the opposite direction as a way to denote tone of sarcasm while typing. I think this is brilliant. Even more recently, we have the lovely work of Adam Stanway, who had proposed such marks, such as the happy mark on the left-hand side that uses an exclamation point, and much like Ambrose Bierce, the kind of parentheses in the form of a smile so that you could deliver good news enthusiastically, and something like sarcastices, which are brackets to inform where we are being sarcastic. So clearly, I'm not the first person to have this idea. I'm not the first person to think about gesture and expression as it pertains to typography. Other people have been thinking about this for quite a long time. But all of this leads back to the heavy sigh and thinking about what this means. Because we do this ourselves, this expresses something. And when we don't have a character that we're looking for, we find other ways of doing this. This is essentially a desire path of language or typography. So when we have an action that we want to do, sometimes we'll put it in asterisks to denote that we're doing something. Or if we take on a certain tone, we might use a certain kind of bracket, like you might in coding, to say this is what's happening at this time. Or we might simply write out phonetically the kind of noise that we are making. So we're kind of doing this anyway. And this is fine, but I think that there's a more elegant solution than this. I think that we could do this better. So that's where I sort of started here. And then I started thinking, okay, I want to make new characters. How do we do this? How are these informed? How do you start making new characters that haven't existed yet in a way that makes any sort of sense? So I'd like to take you through a little bit of that inspiration, with the caveat that while some things are universal, not everything is. So I'm designing from a Western perspective. I live and practice in the United States. I'm working within this particular cultural context. So while some of these gestures make sense here, they might not make sense everywhere. So I just want it to be really clear that this set lives within that context and is not exclusive or exhaustive. So with that being said, some things that I was thinking about as I was designing include things like physical gestures. So often, I was listening to a podcast last week, and someone said something. They said, well, I'm saying that in air quotes, which is pretty amazing because we do this all the time, especially when we're saying something kind of mockingly. And so I was thinking a lot about gesture. What does this gesture look like? What does it mean? How could we incorporate that visually? So physical gestures were a big part of this, even as simple as something like the thumbs up, which of course social media has made even more ubiquitous. How do we think about that particular gesture? I was very interested in how facial expressions factored in. I think everyone has been able to communicate something non-verbally across the room with a frown or a wink or a subtle eyebrow and movement. And so that was something that was very important to me, of thinking about how do we incorporate those really recognizable gestures of facial expressions into these particular characters. Something else that informed these were the relationship between sound and shape. So this includes the Booba Kiki effect, which I think is incredibly cool. So the Booba Kiki effect has come about as a result of a research experiment that has been repeated many times in many countries across many languages and cultures, and has a similar response every time. Whereas the researchers ask participants, they show them these two shapes, and they say, which one is Kiki and which one is Booba? And something like 90+% of the time, People say this shape is Kiki and this shape is Booba. So sharper sound, sharper shape, softer sound, softer shape, which means that the connection between sound and shape is not arbitrary. And so as I was designing, I was thinking about what things sounded like and felt like in the mouth, right? And how they sounded and how that might manifest visually, keeping this in mind. I also thought a lot about social symbols. We know that there are signifiers and what is signified. We can look at something and we can say, okay, this heart, right, it was kind of an abstract heart, it's not the literal human heart, represents love. This is a sign of affection, right? If someone writes a heart, carves a heart into a tree, that means something. And even things that reference that particular shape, in this instance, the less than 3, also represents love. So how can we use those very recognizable social shapes to inform new characters that perhaps haven't existed? And even more to that point, how literal do they need to be? And for that reference, thinking a lot about the ampersand, which is extremely cool. So the ampersand on the far right on the screen is something that we all use all the time. So many of you might know this, but just in case you don't, the ampersand is actually a ligature, which is a combination of 2 or more letters for linguistic or stylistic purposes. And the ampersand happens to be a ligature of the letters E and T, which is Latin for and. So if we look at the center character here, you can see the E and the T, right? And on the other side, this is the more abstract version that we use today. So even though you might not know that this was its history, we still understand that this mostly abstract form means and. So there could be a little bit of room to think about where something started and how we then interpret it later. I was also really interested in the pace of speech. So you may not know this. If you do, this is really exciting. There are different hyphens and dashes for different purposes typographically. So say in instance, merry-go-round uses a hyphen. So this is the shortest of them. And I think this is at least in part because it's the shortest to read or think. Merry-go-round. We don't have to put a pause between them, so we can use a hyphen, which is different typographically from an N dash, which is generally the width of a capital letter N, which we use as a way to denote duration. So if I said, I will be traveling Thursday through Saturday, I would use an N dash. And you can see that's just a little bit wider. So that takes the time that we would need to think or read through that. Furthermore, there is the M dash, which is my favorite of the bunch. The M dash is used to denote a change in thought. If you do 2 hyphens in word processing programs, most of the time it will automatically elongate into an M dash. So it's change in thought. So if we go, but wait, there's more, that requires the most time both to think, speak, and read through. And so this was really intriguing for me to think about the amount of space we need to process, think, read, and speak, and how that might manifest in new characters. I also thought a lot about context and feasibility, because even though I'm making fiction, right, design fiction, speculative characters, they still have to live within the world. They still have to make sense. And I thought these can't be too complicated. They have to be simple enough where if I were writing a quick note before heading out to the grocery store, I wouldn't have to pause and think about them. I could write them out like every other letter and number I know. And so I was thinking a lot about punctuation, where they live. And so I have many pages of a notebook filled with iterations to ensure that they could be written quickly and easily and in a really memorable way. In addition, thinking about how these would be typed, what typeface do they live within? When I designed these, I put them in Helvetica, which is one of the most commonly used typefaces of the 20th century, is still much beloved in the 21st, not by everyone. I did this unironically. I think Helvetica is great. And so I decided to design these characters to fit within Helvetica so that there was a familiar context and we could imagine that kind of context of use. And something that I think is important to share is that when we see finished design work, when we see a presentation of works like this, I think it's really important to note that all of these ideas sit on a bed of failures. Like every single one of these characters that I have designed that I'm about to share comes from a long line of iterations where I started with ideas and my first idea was rarely my best. And so I just had to think through, okay, how is this going to work? How can I write these? Which of these is clearest? What makes the most sense? And so this is a very, very, very small selection of some of the iterations of how these characters came to be, but it was a really important part of the process. And with all of that, I am extremely excited to show you this expanded character set, the speculative characters for visual inflection. The first of which is the effecticon. This is my favorite. The red heart emoji is my most commonly used emoji. So the effecticon is like a hug, like an ampersand, and borrows the social symbol of a heart as a way to communicate love and like and adoration and affection. The shrug sign. I know I'm not the only person that sat in a meeting and had no idea what was going on. So you turn to a colleague and go. So this is that particular gesture of uncertainty as a way to showcase you're not really sure what's going on. There's the elaticon, which is the excited and electric wiggle of excitement. There's the disgust mark. And this is kind of like a frown. It's kind of like a drip. It's kind of like a tongue. It's a little bit gross. And this is where we might use an interjection like bleh or yuck or ugh. There is the awkward pause, which is just a long comma. There's the frustration point. So this is a bit bristling, it's angry, it's like urgent in its gesture, so it's kind of sharp. And this is a way of expressing displeasure and frustration. There's the anticipation point. And this is a ligature of an em dash, a change of thought, and an exclamation point. And I really like this option because I feel as though it gives the right amount of space for a major exclamation without having the typographic redundancy of multiple exclamation points. There's the agree mark, which looks a lot like a thumbs up because it is. So this is a way in which you would show solidarity or agreement. There's the cringe mark, and this is a wince of pain or embarrassment, definitely a cringe, referencing, of course, a facial expression. There's the disinterest mark. This is a scoff. This is an eye roll. This is a dismissive gesture. This is any way that you are telling someone, I am completely and utterly over it. And coming back to air quotes, these are snark marks. These are a new kind of quotation that we could use instead of regular quotations to explain when we are saying something mockingly, which would provide some much needed clarity. In addition, I thought a lot about eyebrows and how we could recontextualize existing punctuation into things like worried quotes, angry quotes, skeptical quotes, and how these could really give nuance to questions. Are we curious? Are we worried? Are we upset? And of course, coming all the way back to the heavy sigh, this is the exaspericon, kind of like an inhale and an exhale. It's long, it takes up that space, it's a bit warning. And this is the heavy sigh. This is saying, it's been a day. And something I'm really, really excited to share is I have two brand new characters that are making their premiere tonight here in this presentation. Because I've been thinking about these works for a long time and thought, what could I add to this series? What have I been thinking about recently that we don't yet have? And so I'm really excited to share the luck mark. How many times has someone said, yeah, we really hope we get the house, and you go, keeping my fingers crossed, right? I use that emoji all the time. How could we incorporate that more elegantly into our type to express that kind of solidarity and that kind of hope? And I know I can't be the only person who is at least a little bit superstitious. And so anytime someone talks about something that's yet to happen, I knock on wood. So here's the knock mark. This is the knocking on wood mark as a kind of strange ellipses that is both the sound and the gesture of what that might sound like. Those are two brand new characters. Really excited to share those. So all of this then, designing these characters, researching these characters, proposing these characters, how are these presented? Like what does this have to do with anything? And so when I share these with the world, and I'm always excited to, we have to talk about how. We have to talk about context of use, because when we propose a new future, we have to frame a new future. If you just say, yeah, this should exist, it doesn't land really well. And so when I have shown these works, and I feel very, very grateful that I've been able to share them in several spaces and in several presentations at this point, I like to think about context, right? So here we have these set up in a really lovely space, the Lexington Art League in Lexington, Kentucky, where I live. And so here they are shown in the capacity of an art exhibit. So people can come through, they can learn, they can see these in context, and they can learn a lot about what typography is and how do we think about these particular kinds of characters. And as I was setting up this exhibition, I could imagine the questions that I would get. So thinking about, well, wait a minute, wouldn't this be complicated for people to learn? I think people could. So every time I show these, I like to share something like the writing guide or punctuation chart to imagine how if kids were learning these for the first time in school, they wouldn't be that difficult to add in. If we can write a question mark, we can write a frustration point, right? So trying to imagine and give greater context of use in the world in a way of world building. I think that's incredibly important. World building allows us to frame this context. We can imagine what these would be like if they were real. And a question I could imagine was going, well, wait a minute, we can't have any more characters. The keyboard is full. No, it isn't. There's space. It can always be adjusted. So here, this is an imagining of where we could put these, and even the new characters are here thinking about where could these belong, where could these live on our keyboard in a way that's really natural and makes sense. And so incorporating these, again, just allows us to build out our imagination a little bit more. And further to that point, imagining what do these look like in different variations? What do these look like in a variety of different typefaces? And so I like to show these in Helvetica, and in a geometric sans serif like Futura, or even in a lovely serif like Baskerville, because I think it helps to be able to see what these look like in a variety of ways and to imagine how they might be used in our communication when type is set in different typefaces. So the question that I get most frequently when I share these works is, when do I get the frustration point? How do I get this on my phone immediately? How do I get this in my email? Really want to use the Effecticon. When is this going to happen? And that's a somewhat complicated question because type and language are not necessarily a top-down decision, right? Someone can propose something, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to catch on. Although I firmly believe and love the quote by the fantastic author Toni Morrison, which is, if there's a book you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And that's how I think about speculative design. I think about these as being proposals for the world, of being things that I can put out there and say, why not? And what if? And could we do this better? And so the reality of this question is, if we want these to exist, we have to use them. There's Unicode, which exists in the world, which is every like character on your keyboard has a specific Unicode. And so when you type a character, when you type a lowercase a, it's always a lowercase a. And new Unicode does get added. There's a Unicode consortium, which adds Unicode to make sure characters can be typed and read, which is very cool. But they really have to be, as far as I understand, in use first before that can happen. And so if you're listening to this and you're like, yes, I want these characters, use them. Write them in your letters, put them in your Christmas cards, do whatever floats your boat. If you think these are cool, like incorporate them into language, because the only way it's going to happen is if we make it happen. And again, this is just one solution, not the only solution by any means. But the way in which I've kind of thought through this is coming back to an earlier point, is that we're already doing this, right? We already are trying to write the heart with less than 3. We're already trying to showcase excitement by using way too many exclamation points, way too many. There are, like, when we try to shrug, we make it out of a whole bunch of different characters to try and show this gesture that we all want to incorporate. And so here, we can do this through things like open type features. So when people design typefaces, they can code in a certain way to say, if this, then this, which means if someone types something, if we have an open type typeface, it can automatically swap and change these characters. And so in Mackinac 1895, mentioned earlier, I did a little bit of this. And so if you type an M dash and an exclamation point next to each other, it will automatically flip to an anticipation point. If you type a less than 3 away from other things, it becomes an effecticon. Right? So if we want this to exist, in the event you're a type designer listening to this, this is how we can make this happen. And I have on my website a PDF that anybody can download that has all of these characters and some suggestions about maybe what that could look like if we were using it in typefaces, because I really do think that these could be cool. They could be great to use. But if we want them to happen collectively, we have to make them happen. It has to be something that we want and that we use and that we think is cool. And I think this falls into a larger conversation about the fact that language is about action and intent, right? How we use language, how language evolves is really a reflection of who we are as people, as a culture, as a society. And I really love, I think about all the time, a quote from Cradle to Cradle by William McDonough and Michael Brungart, the fact that design is a signal of intention. What do we mean? How do we mean it? And of course, language evolves all the time, constantly, which is so exciting. It's thrilling because we have new words that didn't exist before. We have new combinations of words that have new meanings, and things are used in new contexts. And these are just a few examples. I love the evolution of the octothorpe, which is what we might think of as the number sign, also the pound sign, and what we now think of as the hashtag, right? So this has evolved in how we speak about it and how we use it, which is really, really exciting. And this is happening all the time. And so, but we do need to think, maybe carefully and thoughtfully about how language evolves and what we want it to evolve to, because I believe really firmly that how we speak to each other, how we speak about each other matters, like now more than ever. And I think that we can be clearer and kinder and more empathetic in our language, because I can't be the only person that's opened an email or read a text and gone, I have no clue how to read this. So how can we say what we want to say directly and clearly, and in a way that's accessible and fun and nuanced? Because the reality of all of this is that we are going to barrel into the future one way or the other. So I think it's a great idea for us to start thinking about what it is we want this to look like. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I do have the tiniest bit of self-promotion, is that if this was interesting for you, if you're interested in learning more about typography and how we make meaning with typography, I just finished writing my first book. It's called Giving Type Meaning, Context and Craft in Typography, and it's going to be coming out in early 2024 from Bloomsbury Publishing in the United Kingdom, and you can learn more on their site. But I'm really interested in this. I think this is fantastic, and if you are too, check out my new book. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mia. That was really fabulous. I think we have some
Thank you.
time and we have some really great questions from our audience.
Oh,
So
exciting. Great. Cool.
we'll pass those along to you.
Fantastic.
First up, how do symbols and text change across cultures? What are some examples in historical usage, modern emoji usage, etc.?
Oh, wow. That's a really
Big one.
great question. That's a huge question. I have to start by saying I do not have a wide enough knowledge base to answer that really, really confidently, except to say that it does vary by culture, right? There are different emojis that we use in different places. Notably, you may have noticed in the presentation, there's the eggplant, right? Which is not an obvious emoji. And so we can think about that within this kind of cultural context of what that is a stand-in for, right? And so that's what I have. That's what I have presently, but I think it does really vary in terms of the history by if it's happening kind of before the smartphone or after the smartphone, right? Of that kind of history, because before we had emojis, what did we do, right? How did we use emoticons, and then how did they evolve into what we have today? So that might be a vague answer, but that's the most confident answer I can give with the knowledge that I have. That's a great question. Thank you so much for asking.
Very good question. All right. Okay, next up, one of our attendees says, you mentioned that these could help people communicate certain things in a more elegant, I'm going to use air quotes because they wrote
Sure.
quotes, in a more elegant way than i.e., asterisk, or
Yeah.
What would you say makes certain ways of communicating more elegant? Is it about ease of
Ooh.
use or being designed specifically for that purpose?
That's a really, really great question. The way in which I'm using elegant is being designed for that purpose. So I think typefaces like objects have what are called like affordances, like something is designed for a particular use, but we can also use it in a different way. So like a table might be a table and it's designed to sit at, but it might also be a step stool, right? If you're trying to reach something, or it might be a place where your laundry goes when you're done folding it, so it becomes a shelf. We use, I think, letters really similarly. And so I think an elegant solution is to use things that are designed for a particular purpose. And that's what I think makes them a little more elegant. And also thinking about that kind of evolution from emojis is that they can be designed for, specific typefaces. And so if we wanted to have an effecticon in Futura, in Baskerville, in Allegria, we could, and that would be specific to both the typeface, just for examples, specific to typefaces and specific for use. So that's how I've been thinking about that. And I think I could condense them a little bit, like the shrug sign is one character as opposed to a whole bunch of characters, which I think is a little bit more efficient in terms of space. It's a great question. These are fantastic questions.
I love thinking about something as elegant as being designed for a specific purpose.
Yeah.
Okay, next up, some of these characters seem like they could be augmented for emphasis if they are written by hand, i.e. the frustration point could have more jags for extreme frustration, or snark marks could have more points, etc. Is that something you've thought about or would be excited to see?
That's an amazing question. And the answer is yes, yes, yes. I'd be so excited about that. I love the idea that these characters are something that's designed, but maybe something that's not entirely finished. Like, how do they evolve? It may be that the number of points on the frustration point as I've designed them might not actually be the right number. It might be that in use, there become a whole bunch more. And I think that's incredibly cool. Talking about language evolving, it's a natural and organic and kind of weird thing, right? And so I would be really excited to see what other people do with these and how they evolve, especially in things like handwriting or in that kind of organic use. So I think that's a really great thing. And I would be totally excited to see. Yes, absolutely.
Fabulous. I can see a page-long frustration point.
Yes, yes, me too.
Depending on, what your diary entry looks like that day.
All of the frustration, yes.
And of course, this applies to the other more positive ones as well. Okay, great. You already gave in your presentation some great examples about how we might start to break into using these types of marks. But we have a question that asks, what can you do as a creator of these designs to break through the emoticon committee? I think maybe they're the Unicode. How might we get Unicode to accept this?
That's a great question. I obviously can't speak for them. I do not know all the ins and outs of how it happens, but the best educated guess that I can give is to use them, is to have them be used in such a way where people could go, yeah, that's a frustration point. That's a shrug sign. That is a disgust mark. And if enough people use and see them, and if they become something that's recognized, I think then they have a better chance of being recognized on some formal level. Again, I can't say for certain, I am guessing here, but that would be my advice, is if they become common enough and recognizable enough, and then they become part of the language, right? In the way that things like the ampersand are, right? The ampersand didn't always exist, right? That was not something, it happened and it evolved over time, right? And so now we don't have a second thought about using an ampersand because we've been using it for so long. So yeah, I hope that answers.
I mean, and that's one thing we know for sure at Planet Word is language evolves, and language is how people use it. So if we are using it, then maybe we will start to see it in places that make it easier.
Well said.
Or become more widely accepted.
Yeah, awesome.
Great. Okay, we have another question. I'd be curious to know if you'd be willing to focus primarily on characters that are rooted more in common human aspects, such as facial expressions, as opposed to the English centric.
Yeah, that's a really great question. There are, I'm completely like blanking on what the 7 are. There are 7 studies have shown that there are researchers who have said that there are about 7-ish facial expressions that are mostly universal, that everyone in every culture and every language makes, that we can generally perceive and understand what they mean. And so that's an area that I'd love to dive further into and think about how that could be communicated. But what I'd really, really love is if folks who knew specific cultural gestures, I think people should design what they know, right? Like I would love if other people said, hey, I would love to like design a new character for something that's very specific and not in English and not, you know, from a Western culture. I think that's fantastic, right? So I support that fully. I think that it's really wonderful when people bring those, like bring their own culture and their own ideas and their own language to the table, be it in different language or in different dialects of an existing language, right? Which I think is really exciting. I don't know if that answers the question, but yes, I'd be interested, but I'd also be really interested in collaborating with someone who knows more about those linguistic specificities than I do.
Yeah, and like you can download a different language's keyboard for your phone if one's language includes a different kind of gesture than an English centric or a Western centric.
Yeah,
that might be a cool way. Anyway, now I'm brainstorming with you.
Yes. Oh, that's fantastic. Oh no, this is great. That's really exciting. That's a really great and a really thoughtful question. Thank you so much for asking. Yeah.
Great. Okay, another question asks, another visitor asks, I should say, what was your vision of the new signs being used at the beginning versus the end of the sentence?
Oh, that's another question that I have for people who use them. There's a question I've gotten before, and people say, well, you put them at the end or you put them at the beginning. Where do you anticipate they would live? I thought about where they made sense in terms of what you would see before what you would hear. So something like the anticipation point makes sense at the end of the sentence, whereas the kind of excited wiggle, I think, needs to precede the text so that you know how that's being read. The worried quotes and the angry quotes I've put at the end of the sentence. Originally, I had split them on either side, but I realized that without proximity, you couldn't read them as eyebrows. And so I would be really curious to know something about being a designer, of course, is that when you design things, you put them into the world and you get to see how they are, the quote is used and misused. But I think any use is really valuable, right? To see how people think these should live in language. If they go at the beginning of a sentence, if they go at the end of the sentence, if they go in the middle of the sentence, what does that do? What does that add? So I don't feel really strongly about where these have to go. I would be really curious about where people want to put them.
That is, yeah, great. Now, there are a few people who are asking about where or how, if possible, one could cut and paste these symbols that they might start using immediately.
Absolutely. So on my website, miacinelli.com, there is a PDF that has all of these. So if you were interested in using these or interested in referencing these and designing your own typeface or thinking about how these characters could be used, go ahead. Like they're there. they could be copied out of the, especially if you open them in like a vector-based program. They are something that you can find. Now, of course, because they're not in Unicode, you can't type them yet, which is, of course, the somewhat complicated thing. But the image is there. And so that's something that you can explore. So I fully support that. So that's there, that PDF is there.
And we have one final question, unless anybody else has something they want to drop in now. We have a few minutes. One individual would like to know, how do you imagine these speculative characters would sound if used in a text-to-speech program?
Wow, that's a great question. I think it would depend on if the program could pick up, like if you were to say that you wanted a full stop, or you wanted an exclamation point, or you wanted a question, or if it can pick up on that kind of inflection, right? So if you were to say, okay, snark marks this part, or anticipation point this, or shrug sign following this. So I think it would really depend on if the sound to speech could pick up on inflection, or if you would have to manually say or explicitly say, I want there to be this character. I want there to be the disgust mark at the end of this, or if it would automatically sub for something like or blah. That's a great question. These are really great questions. These are like fantastic, very thoughtful. These are great things to think about. Yeah.
Oh, and a great comment. This would expand the reading of the deaf and possible Braille. So there's an accessibility aspect to this as well.
I think accessibility is really important. Again, I think the more clear and kind and direct we can make our communication, the better it is for everyone. I mean, I think having more options is almost always better. I think having more ways to say what we want to say, more typefaces, more language, more punctuation, just allows us a richer palette of ways to communicate and ways to express ourselves, and more ways to be accessible. So I fully agree.
Fabulous. Okay, and there are a few folks who are interested in seeing these works in person, if possible. I don't believe that your Lexington show is still up. So there may not be a physical place that one can see it now, but I don't know, maybe you all can print them and hang them.
They're always available on my website to see, and I'm always excited to share these works and exhibit these works. They have been in several traveling exhibitions, and so if this is something that you want to see, sorry for the shameless self-promotion, is it something you want to see in your community? Reach out, let me know. I'm always excited to share them, because I feel I love to be a part of the discourse, whether it's these particular characters, right? Or if it's just the idea of these characters. I love the idea that we can talk about and converse, and people can leave and go, what if there was a character for this, right? I hope that this contributes to a discussion and a discourse. And so I'm always happy to collaborate.
Fabulous. Mia, thank you so much for A, creating this amazing work, B, sharing it with us, and C, giving this lovely presentation and thoughtfully answering all of our questions.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everybody for being here and for asking such great questions. I'm truly, truly grateful.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here tonight, and come back and see us again.